See you in the 24th century.
I look forward to it. Or should I say backward?
Don't get started.
As discussed in the episode before this one, you can find it in the top right-hand corner or in the description, after inventing time travel in the 23rd century and being able to simply adjust the engine mixture of a Constitution-class vessel, then being able to go wherever you wanted, Starfleet in the 24th century apparently just chose not to do this. There's no exact reasoning why. The Federation just stopped utilizing time travel after having discovered it. However, a likely scenario is that Starfleet classified the information and forbid its usage. This would cause the information and knowledge to ultimately be lost to the annals of time, kind of like a spore drive. Now, whether there was a complete ban on it or it was still used in the background by organizations such as Section 31 remains somewhat of a mystery. However, given how events will ultimately pan out, it's likely that the usage of time travel was highly restricted. We know this by what characters say, or more importantly, what they don't. It can be observed in The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. One of the most prominent examples would be in TNG, in fact. Specifically the episodes Time's Arrow Part 1 and Time's Arrow Part 2. For those who need a brief recap, we have a Starfleet officer stuck in the past with the possibility of death going to occur. Here, the usage of time travel technology would have been vital to ensure the safety of both the timeline and the officers involved. However, due to the dialogue and what we observe, it appears that this likely isn't an option available to them. Hell, I'd say they didn't even know it was a possibility. In fact, entire departments were created to ensure that time travel didn't occur, and if it did, it was minimized on what happened. To be fair, it could be argued that time travel technology was prohibited so that events like what we see in Time's Arrow would occur. That there was a paradox of them having to go back in time, possibly being killed to preserve the timeline. It always happened like that, and they had to ensure that it did. Whether this was something that the future Federation traveled back in time to tell the Federation of the past to do so that everything would work out, or it's just happenstance, we don't know. Though Starfleet's Time Bureau will be something I break down in the next episode.
Where I come from, every historian knows the bridge of old 1701D.
Where exactly do you come from?
My Earth. The late 26th century Earth, to be exact.
It is, I guess, ironic that the explosion of Federation culture and the expansion of Starfleet throughout the stars would occur simultaneously with temporal apathy. Even more curious, as time travel would become commonplace around the 26th century. At least, that's what it looks like. It would be from this era that a time travel pod arrives to the Enterprise D. The pilot of the pod would ultimately be found to be a criminal who either killed or incapacitated the actual owner and used it to travel throughout time and space. The criminal would ultimately be caught, and the pod's auto-return function would return the vessel to the 22nd century where it had come from, doing untold amount of damage to that era, which this honestly doesn't seem to bother the crew of the Enterprise D, so it's not going to bother us either. The existence of the pod does present a bit of a problem in continuity that does need to be addressed. From everything we know in the TNG episode, this was a matter of time for those who want to go back and watch it, the pod appears to be from the Federation.
Oh, this is a time pod, and it is from the 26th century. At least, that's what the poor fellow said. You see, he decided to travel back to the 22nd century. That's my time. And he had the misfortune of meeting me. His clothes fit quite well, don't you think? Took me weeks to figure out how to work this thing.
The criminal, Rasmussen, would meet the original historian who owned the pod, ultimately overtake him, put on the man or woman's clothes, figures out how to use the ship, and travels through the cosmos. Again, the ship originally came from the 26th century, went to the 22nd century, and ultimately ended up in the 24th century. All of this only really fits neatly if the original traveler, again the real historian that was killed or left behind, was actually a human, and the tech comes from the Federation. It's possible that this is not the case, but it is more logical that the inventor would have figured out how to use the time travel pod if there was some connection to him, even if it was centuries away from when he existed. But the real reason all of this is a problem is because of someone we've already talked about before, Future Guy. From what Daniels tells us, he is from the 28th century. This pod, this 26th century pod, doesn't make much sense because future guy in the 28th century would hopefully be able to get one so that he could go and travel and meet the Xindi. He would not be limited to a formless avatar as we see. Again, Daniels even points out the limitations of the technology of his time, which means that Daniels is either lying or isn't expanding on why it's limited. And this isn't just a one-off. In the 27th century, a scientist by the name of Cal Dano sends the Tox Uthot, a weapon of mass destruction, back in time to the 22nd century to safeguard it. Also, what the hell is it with time travelers in the 22nd century, but anyway. It does point us back to the question, this isn't just a one-off. Why would Future Guy use relatively inferior technology to what was available in his century? Well, one answer, and this one was given to me by Lore Runner, which I really like, is that it's possible the 28th century is another dark period or dystopian era for time travel. With the issues that we see with Rasmussen, as well as the Tox Uthot, the Federation might have began to restrict time travel technology heavily. This would mean that it would be highly unlikely that anyone could get their hands on real technology that they could use, and those within the 28th century would only have rudimentary options. Another option, one that I really like, is that Future Guy is someone else and hiding his abilities on purpose, like what I said may be the case with the guy in the glasses. I still personally hold to that one, by the way. Regardless, we wouldn't see much from the 26th and 27th centuries. Again, something holding them back, possibly the Federation, as I've discussed. In the 28th century, Starfleet begins to actively protect time. Whether they are the only force or one that works in conjunction with other powers, we don't know. What we do know is that vessels like the time ship Aeon and the USS Relativity would be constructed and correct errors in the time-space continuum. Though with these timekeepers, it's interesting how they only make changes that positively impact the Federation, at least in the episodes that we see. This does lead to a theory that I've discussed in the past, but I'm doing another video on it in the near future about how they're possibly not as noble as we think. The 28th century to the 31st century marks the proliferation of time travel technology. During the same time that the Temporal War was raging, the general populace knows about and even utilizes tools for exploring the past. As an example, even high school students in the 31st century dealt with quantum discriminators in their desks. These devices would determine exactly when a message in time was to be sent and was considered a rudimentary tool for teaching. It was so harmless, though, it was given to children. However, the Age of Enlightenment with time travel came to a crashing halt in the 32nd century when all time travel was outlawed and all of the technology destroyed. How this was guaranteed is still a mystery, if it was guaranteed at all. Like with the Golden Age and Federation in the 24th century, the era for Enlightenment for the temporal powers was also a gilded time with much more happening in the background. We'll discuss that and more in the conclusion of this series.
Wait a minute, let me get this straight. I'm going back in time to stop Braxton. But you already have him.
And there's a third one in our brig. I arrested him earlier today.
But don't worry.
They'll all be reintegrated in time for the trial.